This morning, I got to confess something to you. Because I don't know if you're like me, but I have some things that irritate me. And they're dumb. They're dumb things. And I'm sure none of you have these little dumb things that irritate you like I do. I'm the only flawed person here, I'm sure. But they're just grating. They just irritate me. And it's so ridiculous. And it's so, I know that it shouldn't irritate me, but I got to talk about one of those things today. It's vacation photos. I don't want to see your vacation photos. I know it's dumb. I know it's really sort of probably small of me, but when you post all these photos on Facebook, and heaven forbid, I get texts of vacation photos to my personal phone. I don't want to see them. I'm sorry. And my guess is that most of you don't want to see other people's either. And especially your friends and your neighbors don't want to come over to your house for the 1,000-photo slideshow of your trip to Europe. Nobody wants to see that. It irritates me. So I'm sorry if you think less of me now this morning. But don't send me your pictures. But what's worse than you standing in front of the Magic Kingdom is when people take pictures like this. Oh, I hate these. I hate pictures like this. We know you're not holding the balloon. We didn't think suddenly he went on vacation and Bill got huge. We know this. It despises me. I can't stand it. You're not actually holding the Louvre. You're not fooling anybody. But we take these cheesy pictures, and honestly, I don't even know what's happening here. Is it coming out or going in? I don't know. Why do we do this? And it irritates me, guys. I'm just telling you, it irritates me. And it shouldn't. I know it shouldn't. I should be bigger than this, but it's irritating to me. And there is no place on earth that this happens more frequently than the little town of Pisa. You know, Pisa is not that easy to get to. You have to fly into Rome and you take a train, and it's kind of a long trip. And I'm convinced that most people who go there simply go there to do this. They've spent thousands of dollars and a long period of time to get to this place so that you can not admire the beautiful architecture of this bell tower, but so that I can karate kick it. I do kind of like this one because this took a lot of time, I think, to get the timing right on that. But I hate these pictures, guys. I just do. It drives me insane. But they have a name. It's called forced perspective. Forced perspective is this photographic technique that you probably didn't even know you're doing if you would admit that you're taking pictures like this. But what it does is it forces the viewer to see what the scene is by taking the background and the foreground and putting them in the same plane. So it makes the things in the background look smaller, makes things in the foreground look larger. It's forced in the way that you can only view this from one particular angle, which is what the photographer has intended. So you get these goofy sort of looks here. But what's interesting is that real life doesn't work that way. That all of you get to view the life that you lead from your particular angle, but you can move. That's a good thing. You can move around the room. You can see things from different angles, but not in forced perspective. You only get to see it from one side. But if you could travel yourself to Pisa, you would see a very different scene than what we've seen in these pictures. You'd actually see something that looks more like this. Yeah. They look really dumb, don't they? Yes. See, actually in Pisa, this is what everybody looks like. It's some sort of weird Tai Chi. Or some have said this looks like the Thriller video. Everybody's kind of doing the Thriller dance. Yeah, this is what it really looks like there. But that's the thing about perspective. Perspective looks different from the angle or point of view that you're looking at through. So from one way, the picture looks, okay, kind of cool or irritating to me. But in reality, it looks something quite different. That's the thing about perspective. You know, we have played with perspective all of our lives and probably not really even paid attention to it or noticed it. I imagine as a kid, you saw an image that looked like this. And so some of you may see the young woman with her face turned away from you. Others may see the old woman in her profile. Some of you may see both. Some of you may not see anything at all, and if that is the case, I suggest you call your doctor. But it's perspective. Depending on how your mind interprets this image, you see it a particular way. Then there's this one. Some of you see a rabbit. Some of you see a duck. Some of you need to ask your neighbor what they see because you may not see one or the other. This image is over 100 years old. It was used in a study on creativity. And it was determined that they could measure your creativity based on how quickly you could see both images. So some of you are finding out right now that you're not very creative. That's okay. But we've played with perspective all of our lives. We see these optical illusions. And I love optical illusions because it's how your brain and your eyes interpret images. It's so interesting and fascinating to study. But it all comes down to, in these particular points, as perspective. You view the world in a very specific way. The way that your brain interprets the world around you influences how you see things. It's your point of view. And what's interesting about it is that ours are different. Our perspectives are different. Our points of view are different. And so we see the world around us very, very differently. We can measure that by looking at an image like this. There's no optical illusion here. This is just the proverbial age-old question. How much water is in the glass? Some say half full. If you're an optimist. If you're a pessimist, you may say it's half empty. If you're confused, you may say, I don't remember drinking the water. But it's not an optical illusion. It depends on your experience. It depends on how your brain interprets this. It depends on how you have lived in your life and your world. And so you see this image very differently than everybody else. But the thing about perspective that we need to keep in mind this morning is that there's a more important question we have to ask, and that is, what's the reality? What's the reality of that image that we saw? The reality is that it's neither half full nor half empty. The reality is that it's a glass with water in it. That's it. That's the reality of the situation, but your brain and your experience have interpreted that in a particular way. That's your perspective. And what we notice sometimes is that our perspective doesn't always reflect reality. You see this a lot of times in your kids, right? Not to say that we are immune as adults, but kids tend to, let's say, exaggerate the situation a little bit based on their perspective, their point of view. Because my guess is that your kids or kids you have been around have said things like, this is the most important thing ever. They've never done that? No? You've never been around a teenager? I love you guys. You know that I love you guys. But this is what teenagers do all the time. This is the most important. This is the biggest thing. I can't do it. I will just die if I don't have this. Now, as adults, what do we say? We know that there's a gap, there's a difference between the perspective and reality. You see, it can be summed up in this cartoon. The guy on the island sees the boat and thinks he's rescued. The guy on the boat sees the island and says, I'm rescued. What's the reality? They're both lost. That's the reality. But see, their perspective is not the same as what the reality is. There's a gap there, and we witness it all the time. We see this gap between this perspective and reality in our lives constantly. And when there is a great enough gap, we have a phrase for it. Somebody has maybe told you this, and I know that you have told your kids this. Man, you just got to gain perspective. Have those words ever come out of your mouth? What do we mean? We mean that there is a gap between your perspective and reality, and you got some catching up to do. Right? That we need to step out of our viewpoint. Usually we mean we need to look at from a broader picture. We try to tell our kids, this is just a little moment in your time. Your life is so long. The world is so big. We got to gain perspective. We got to try to take that gap and tighten it up, merge it a little bit. Well, got one more illustration for you this morning. Tell me in your mind, don't tell me out loud, but what do you see here? In this collection of letters together, what does your mind tell you that it says? Myself, when I look at this, and for many of you may have seen this illustration before, it's been out there for a long time, but for most people when they see this, they see a phrase that says this: God is nowhere. Your brain takes those letters and it puts spaces in there to create a phrase. God is nowhere. Probably some of you today saw that. And you'd be like, myself. But you can look at this in a different way. And some people see it like this: God is now here. Two very different meanings in the same collection of letters, right? And it depends on our perspective. It depends on the way that we view things. It depends on how we are feeling at that moment. For some of us, we're feeling, man, God is nowhere in my life. For some of us, though, we are really up and we're really high and we're really excited and we're really positive and we're saying, God is now here. It's the same phrase or the same collection of letters, two phrases. But the question is, what's the reality? The reality is, neither one of those phrases is true. Now stop for a second. What do I mean? On one hand, of course, obviously, right? We know that to say that God is nowhere is false because of what you believe here. But what's the reality of this? When I say it's not true that God is now here, I need to explain myself, right? Psalms tells us in 139, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you're there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me. And your right hand will lay hold of me. The reality is that God is here, but he's not now here, as if he's a genie that appears and disappears. You see, we look at that collection of letters and our perspective tells us either that God is nowhere if we're down, or tells us that God is now here if we're up. But the reality is that God always is, because he tells us, I'm the I am. That's past, present, and future. God doesn't come and go. God doesn't disappear. That's the reality. But our perspective doesn't always reflect that. And I'm going to give you the clue why. Because our perspective is very different than God's perspective. You see, our perspective is a very human one, and it is influenced, and it rides up and down, and it depends on what's going on in our lives at that particular moment. But God's perspective is consistent. Even greater than that, God's perspective is reality. Amen. How cool would that be? For us to have a perspective like God that sees things clearly every single time. To see what the reality of this world and this life is all about. Unfortunately, though, there's a gap. There's a gap between our human perspective and God's. There just is. Because we see through this very human lens and not through God's. That's not what he wants for us, though, as we see in Colossians 3. Paul writes to the church there, therefore, if you've been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above where Christ is seated, at the right hand of God. And here's the kicker. Set your mind on things above and not things that are on the earth. What Paul is telling the people in Colossae is that they need to gain some perspective. You see, this gap between our human perspective and God's needs to be overcome because our human perspective needs to have our sights focused on the things above. And what do we mean by that? We mean God's perspective. What if we saw this world and this life through God's eyes and not our own? How would that change you? How would that change what you did? How you lived your life? How you looked at other people? How you looked at the down moments, the terrible things that occur? How would you look at the good times, the blessings, the things to be thankful for? What if you were able to be in a forced perspective view of God? To only see things the way that He does. Now, I'm not talking about His immeasurable wisdom and His foreknowledge and all of the wonderful things and attributes that make God. I'm not saying that at all. We can't do that. We can't be that. But we can, in our human way, attempt to view the world as God does from a higher purpose. Because we're supposed to set our minds on those things, not these. So this morning, I think we can admit to each other that we've got that gap. That we're too frequently, like our kids and our teenagers, crying and yelling about things that we see from our very narrow point of view, instead of from the larger perspective of God's. So if that's the case, then we need to look at what we can do to gain that spiritual perspective. Can we do that this morning? Let's take a look at what we can do to try to gain that perspective, to try to put ourselves in a position where we view the world through God's eyes and not these human ones. And the first thing we have to do, and it is almost always universally the thing we have to do as humans, is we have to humble ourselves. It is almost always the first step in everything we have to do spiritually. Because we got to get out of our own way. We got to get out of this fleshly body. We have to step outside of ourselves if we're going to put ourselves in the position to view the world as God does. How do we humble ourselves? I think here is a great example of Jonah. I love the story of Jonah because it's nice and short. It's always nice for us. But it's this incredible account of a guy who's very human. When God tells him to go to Nineveh, Jonah doesn't want any part of that. Why? We don't know in the first chapter of Jonah, but we can infer things by later in the book. He doesn't think those people in Nineveh are worth anything. That's Jonah's perspective. That's the way he views them. He goes, man, those people in Nineveh, they're not worth my time. Just wipe them off the map. Now, I know that we're probably never like that. I know that we're probably never that harsh or that mean, or we, say bad things about Ohio. I'm sure that we never, ever act like that. But of course we do, and that's why Jonah, we can relate to him so much, because he's so human, and he has this human point of view and this human perspective, and he's like, you know what, it's going to be better off if I go in the opposite direction, because I don't want any part of that. That's his perspective, and we know what happens. We know the storm comes up, and he's like, well, this is because I did something dumb, so now I need to jump overboard, and they do. But what's God's perspective here? His perspective is that I don't care where Jonah goes, I don't care what Jonah does, he's going to do my will, even if it means a great fish. And what a place to gain perspective than in the belly of an animal. Change your point of view? Yeah, I would think so. Changes Jonah's. And look what he does in his prayer to God. When he is recognizing this, having his enlightenment moment, he says this, "But I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord." I would argue that Jonah humbles himself in a place that would be very humbling. Admittedly so. But Jonah humbles himself. He goes, man, you know what? God, you are in control. Jonah lowers himself, and it's the first step for him to gain some perspective through the eyes of God. Now we know that Jonah, much like us, goes up with God, I got the perspective, and then falls again. We know that he does that, and he starts cursing the plant, and there's a whole scene where he acts like a little baby throwing a tantrum, like us. But we see in that moment the first step on him understanding and gaining this perspective is to humble himself. The second is this. We got to trust in his plan. See, it goes along the lines of wanting to see what's coming ahead. See, that's sort of our perspective and our point of view. We think we know what's right, and that's one of the reasons we have to humble ourselves. But the second, it becomes very difficult to trust in God's plan because we only see this very narrow window of events. And in order to gain this perception that we're trying to get, this perspective, that we're trying to get to that point, we have to trust that God knows better than us, even when our perspective is so limited. So to see through his eyes, we have to put ourselves wholly into his plan. And there's a great example of this in 1 Kings, where you have Elijah. And Elijah gets to have this incredible experience on Mount Carmel, where he is a total witness to the miraculous events that God can bestow on his people. And he gets to show all of the prophets of Baal the power and majesty of God. That's the point of view Elijah gets to see. He gets to see the power and energy that God can bestow on his command. But you know what happens next, right? If you've studied the story. He kills all of these prophets of Baal, and not surprisingly, Jezebel now wants to kill him. And so he runs. He runs away. And we see Elijah act like a human. We see him act from the human perspective, where he goes, I'm going to be killed. I have to run away. And he lays down and he wants to just die because he says it's better. It's just better for me to die. He's at a low moment in his life, and it's like us. The low moments we get in our lives when we can't see from God's perspective, we just see this human, fleshly one, and we go, man, I'm in trouble, and now I don't know what I'm going to do. Can you relate to that? Yes. That's a human perspective. That's not God's, because what do we see in the next scene? We see Elijah is told, after he's cared for his physical needs, he's told to go up to the mountain. And he's told that God is going to pass by. And we see this incredible demonstration of the rocks quaking and the fire come. And we see the gentle blow. And it's at that point that he gets to go out and speak with the Lord. What do we see in verse 13 of chapter 19? Look at this together with me if you have it. Verse 13. And when it came about, when Elijah heard it, that gentle breeze, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now, that's my emphasis on this. I'm sure God didn't sound like that, but when I read it, that's how I read it. Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? And Elijah shows us his perspective. He says, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, torn down thine altars, and killed thy prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Elijah has a human perspective when he looks around and he says, it's just me. Everybody else has forsaken you. Everybody else has left you. There's nobody else, and now they want to kill me too. I'm all alone. Is that a human perspective or what? Yeah. There's very few places in this world, in today's world, that you can go and actually be alone. I mean, you can sit in the middle of downtown Detroit with hundreds of people around you, thousands of people surrounding you, but you can feel alone, can't you? You see, that's a human perspective. That's not the reality of it. The reality is there's billions of people in this world. You're not alone. But your perspective says, I'm all alone. That's what Elijah feels here. It's just me. But let's take a look through God's perspective. He says to him in verse 15, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu son of Nimish you shall anoint king over Israel." 2 new kings. "And Elisha the son of Shepheth of Abel you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it shall come about, the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. And the one who escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Look at the scene through God's eyes. Elijah says, "I'm all alone." That's his perspective. What's God's perspective? Man, I got so many people out there to help you. God's perspective is so much bigger. It's so much grander. It's so much broader. And here's the point. It's the reality. The reality is that Elijah's not alone. He's got 7,000 people behind him. He's going to have these kings who are going to strike down the prophets of Baal. He's going to have these people who are going to help him and support him and surround him. But can Elijah see that? Because he's looking through the human eyes. And that's why we need to trust in God's plan. Because the thing about God's perspective is, well, hey guys, he's got this. He's got a plan. He has a purpose. Elijah couldn't see it because he was blinded by his own human perspective. But when we look through God's eyes and we gain the spiritual perspective, we see this whole plan. We see this whole purpose. And we see an army there that Elijah never saw otherwise. We have to humble ourselves. We have to trust that God has a plan. And then we have to do our best to do this. We got to focus on the infinite, not the finite. What does that mean? What does it mean to focus on the infinite and not the finite? How do we do this? This is how what we need to do to gain this perspective. We get so blinded as human beings by this fleshly, physical stuff. Don't we? Yes. It's not just me. What's God's perspective? Is it this? Is it this earth right here? Is it how you feel when you get up in the morning? Is it how much money is in your bank account? It's how well the children are doing? No. It's the infinite. You see, 2 Corinthians tells us this very tale. "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." You want to gain some spiritual perspective? You don't look what is right in front of you. You look at things that are eternal. That's God's perspective. You realize that, right? I hope so. I hope. Because everything that you see in the life of Jesus, everything that you see in the life of the apostles, none of it is about cushy, feel-good, earthly things. In fact, it's the exact opposite. But we get so bogged down in it. We get so bogged down in the things of the world and trying to be a part of this place and try to fit in and try to gain things so that we can be upheld and lifted around by our peers. We get so caught up in this, and that's a human way to see it. But what does God want? How does he see this earth? Jesus tells us in Luke, it's 2 things. Love God and love other people. And if we love God, what do? We obey his commands. And if we love other people, what do we do to them? We seek and save that which is lost. That's it. That's all this earth is here. It's here for us to do God's will. That's all he sees. That's all he cares about. Now, of course, we know that he takes care of us. He cares for our needs. He knows that we have physical things. Jesus had physical needs that were taken care of and cared for him. We know that. We have to survive. We have to eat. We have to breathe. We have to drink water. We have to live in this world. But what's our priority here? It's going home and taking as many people we can with us. You see, in order to gain this perspective, this spiritual perspective, we got to start looking at people as souls. And not as neighbors, cousins, family, friends. We got to see this job that we have as just something that puts food in my mouth and not the boat in my driveway. We got to see this world as just this temporary, fleshly place that it is. And set our minds on things eternal. Because that's how God sees them. God sees this world in a wholly different way than we have ever been taught to. And thus exists the gap between our human perspective and God's. Now, as is often the case, this is not an all-inclusive, everything here kind of list. There are many other facets that we can go, but I think it's a start, and a start that we have to take. We have to start making the step to get out of my point of view and into God's point of view, because it's going to change my life. Because if I can see the bigger picture spiritually, that changes how I interact with everybody. It changes how I worry about the things that are happening in my life. You know what? If I'm down and I am beaten, it changes how I view that. And if I am high up and I am blessed and I am positive, it changes how I view that too. It changes everything. It's like looking at the pictures of the Tower of Pisa and the people holding it up, and you see it one way. If that was the only view that you ever saw, that's what you would think. You would think the Tower of Pisa is 5 feet tall. But when you see the reality, it opens your eyes. And the same thing when we try to look through the eyes of God. It changes you. And it's something we as Christians, I believe, have done a really poor job in doing, and that we have to get better at. We have to get better at. Because when we do that, this spiritual perspective gives us peace. It gives us peace. Because when the things happen in my life, when the roof literally caves in, I get peace. Because I don't see the pieces of the roof on the ground. I see this as a temporary home. I sing my song, "This world is not my home." And when I'm high up and everybody's praising me and lifting me up and glorifying me, I don't get the big head. I say, man, God has blessed me here, but I'm looking forward to the blessings there. Amen. You see, it gives me peace. Spiritual perspective gives me peace, and it's the peace that Jesus tells to us in John 14. The peace that God gives to us is not like the world's peace. What do we think of here? What do we talk about with peace of mind here? We usually say peace of mind and like financial stability on the other side of the equation, right? We say things like that. We say, let's get our finances in order so that we can have peace of mind. Now, of course, I think that that's a really good thing. But it's not the peace that God gives to us. The peace God gives to us is when we see through His eyes. We see the world as temporary, as fleeting, as but a vapor. Then that gets us through because we're looking at the eternal. Amen. We don't have to be troubled. We don't have to be afraid. We don't have to worry about the things of this world. We don't have to be like our neighbors and our friends and our family who are pulling their hair out because this life has beaten them down. We get to say, I'm not worried about this life. I'm worried about that life. What a gift you have to give to people. You realize that? As a Christian, you have this gift. You have this knowledge. Your eyes are open to this perspective. Don't you want to share it with folks around you? That's what this world is looking for. They're looking for peace. They're looking for perspective. They're looking to make things in their life better. And you have the key to it, and it's like keeping it to yourself. I don't want to share this. But a lamp is not covered. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. That's what we're called to be. So our steps this morning as we walked through this is to say that we ourselves need to open our eyes and see through God's perspective. And when we do that, we have peace. But then, of course, we need to take that out to everybody else in the world. But unfortunately, like a photograph, we can't force this perspective on you. This is a choice you have to make. But when we choose to see things through a human perspective, we're limiting ourselves. It's like this phrase, I love this. If the only tool you have is a hammer, then you tend to see every problem as a nail. I'm afraid that if the only tool you have is your human perspective, then all you see is problems. This morning we offer to you an option, a different perspective. And it's the one that has come from the creator of the universe. The one who is infinite, not finite. The one who knows all, sees all, has a plan for you. And we just got to humble ourselves and trust in it and set our sights on things above. Folks, let's gain a little perspective this morning, can we? Let's receive that peace that Jesus offers to us. If you're here this morning and you haven't had that opportunity to study his word or to immerse yourself into his scripture so that you can see the promise of salvation, to go into the waters of baptism, to come out a new person, and to look through these godly eyes at the world around you, then we want to talk to you this morning. We want to share that good news with you. If you're like many of us here and have just gotten blinded by the world, gotten focused in our own little point of view, then let's break that out. Let's break out of that together. Let's work through that. Let's share this peace with each other and the world around us. If there's any way that we can be of help this morning, don't hesitate to come forward as we stand and sing.